Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Diagram Control, Advanced Tips and Tricks, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher and CTO Julian Bucknall. In today's session, they will tackle the more technical side of the control and delve into topics such as building diagrams via code, introducing custom shapes, and top support questions. FYI, this session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Julian and Paul.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the diagram series. Now, last week, Julian and I showed you just how easy it was to actually create a diagram-based application, something like a Visio-esque or a Visio-inspired application with very little or no code. Now, this week we're going to go through and do a fair bit more, which means I should probably introduce Julian. So good morning, Julian.
Good morning, Paul, and good morning, everybody. Yes, last week it was, I think, half a line of code. I think we just changed one line of code. But this week it's going to be an awful lot more. So crack your knuckles, we're ready to go. What are we going to be doing?
Well, we'll spend some time looking at SVGs and toolbox items and shapes, discuss how to create some XML items in your toolbox instead of SVGs, work through some property events and methods, and basically play with a couple of examples. One of the interesting things with the product, and we made a big point of this last week as far as how simple the diagram control can be made to be used, but of course then when you start trying to add code behind, it becomes a bit of a challenge because the teams have done such a stellar job. It's like, well, what do I do? How do I add code?
Right. And I like the first item you have there because after reading through some of the comments and questions from last week's webinar, we saw that a lot of people were very interested in being able to add their own elements to the diagram toolbox. And one of those, the easiest way of doing that actually is through SVG. So I'm glad we're going to be talking about programmatically adding elements, icons, shapes to the diagram control toolbox.
Absolutely. And the response really has been overwhelming. A number of people have contacted us explaining how they'd like to use the diagram control. Of course, some people, well, more than a few, have said that they'd like to see something in other platforms, which I'm not even going to get into right now. But in essence, even when we do this programmatically, there's some elements that we've uncovered with 16.2. We're in constant discussions with the teams, and I know that we've got some of the key team members again on the call today, which is phenomenal for the engineers themselves to hear how excited and how much feedback is coming from customers to say, hey, this is really cool. Can we add this feature? Can we do this? So we'll step through some of the more frequent questions.
Okay.
Now, in a world of acronyms, SVG, WTF. So, Julian, what is a scalable vector graphic and why should I care?
So SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. They're essentially on a computer screen. There are two different ways of displaying or using graphic elements. The first one is a raster image, and we're very familiar with those. That's what our cameras take. They're raster images. We produce JPEGs or GIFs or PNGs. And the other one is a vector. Now, a vector image it's kind of peculiar. It's actually drawn when the graphic is displayed. That seems a bit daft. It's drawn when it's displayed. If you imagine that a raster image essentially is a set of pixels. Each pixel has a particular color, and that is it. Each pixel is the same size. So when you grow this image, what does the software that grows the image, what does it have to do? It has to basically replicate these pixels, individual pixels. And so you get this kind of weird, we're all familiar with this kind of jagged look to our graphics when we blow up. Pixelated, or something like that. And to be honest, in these days of high-resolution screens, it's horrible. It really is. We ought to be moving away from raster images for our icons, for example, and moving away from that completely. In fact, if you think about it, fonts are vector images. They are not raster images, not like the old days when you had your green screen and each glyph in your font was the same size. It's probably something like 8 by 16 pixels or something like that, and you could actually see the individual pixels. So fonts these days are scalable. So if you have your 36-point title, it looks like it's been properly drawn. There's no jaggies, as us oldies like to call them. So vector graphics are essential, I would say, for drawing images that need to be scaled, that need to look good, small or large. And SVG was created 15 plus years ago by the World Wide Web Consortium. I mean, they created the standard, and then the browsers all went, oh yeah, we want to support this. It was created about 15 years ago. It says 1999 on Wikipedia, so holy camoli. And what we're talking about here is not necessarily using SVG inside the browser. We're going to be using it in WinForms inside the diagram control. But SVG is just a simple XML format that defines a set of elements within the image that you want to produce. The most obvious one is a path. A path is just a simple outline, a simple set of lines joined together. There are some basic shapes, rectangles and circles and ellipses and what have you. You can put in text. You can. The other nice thing is it supports things like gradients and patterns for the fill color, for the fill elements. Here, Paul is showing us a couple of examples of SVGs here. The first one is a very simple SVG. It's just a bunch of rectangles of a particular color. And the second one on the side defines a very complex path. A path is essentially, I don't know whether anybody has actually drawn, images with .NET, for example, where you say, okay, move the point that we want to start drawing to a particular coordinate, and then draw a line to this coordinate, or maybe draw a Bezier curve or an elliptical curve to this point and fill in the shape that we produced, and so on and so forth. So it's fairly complicated. SVG sounds fairly simple, but it's fairly complicated in the kind of things you can do with the elements inside the SVG vector. And as we'll see in a moment, that can cause problems, but we'll just leave that, hanging there for the moment.
Now, in our demos, we actually ship some sample SVGs for the Office plan, and we're going to be taking a look at some of those as well. From the example I looked at just before, those SVG files are done in this fashion, where they're collections of rectangles or different shapes with their elements. And we're also going to play with some other SVGs as an example of the right-hand side. Julian is a big fan of a site called Font Awesome. And
so, Font Awesome is great. I use it on my own personal websites. Essentially, it's a font. It's a font for the web, and each of the glyphs in the font is a separate icon. And it supports icons for social networking, as Paul is showing here. So we have the Slack icon and all this kind of stuff. And it's just very nice, open source, set of glyphs that you can use in your websites. Very nice. The nice thing is that about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, there was a Kickstarter by the Font Awesome guys to say, we really want to add a lot more icons. There are about 600 plus at the moment of these icons, and they want to, grow it a lot more. And one of the features they want to add is SVG versions of these icons. And so at the moment it's just a special font, but they want to produce SVG versions of version 5. A lot more icons and all as a font or as SVG. Because it's open source, somebody has actually gone and generated the SVGs for all of the glyphs in the font anyway, as Paul is showing here, and it's available on GitHub. And so that's what Paul has just done. He's downloaded all of those SVGs, and we're going to play around with them now inside a little bit of code, I think.
Absolutely. One of the things I do want to mention, there are some current, I'll use the word current, limitations when it comes to support for SVG elements. For example, we don't support CSS, style, opacity, group transform, group attribute, text element, or line cap. So when you start playing or exporting your image elements out as SVGs, you need to just be aware that some of those things are not supported. What I'm going to do is create a small application and actually show you how to add those elements into your toolbox using a bit of code. We'll start out with our Visual Studio code. At the moment I've just got some placeholders for this create toolbox items method and a couple of preset paths, but that's the only code I've got up until now. I'll start it by dropping the diagram control onto the designer, and then I will do the create ribbon and then also create the toolbox and property grid, so everything's going to be bound nicely. One of the things that we noticed when we were preparing or doing a rehearsal for today's presentation is that Visual Studio has been playing up a lot today.
Yes, so our rehearsals have been fun. Let's put it like that, fun. You have those days, I'm sure, you're just using Visual Studio and nothing goes right. Well, that was our day preparing for this webinar.
Simple things like executing the application in Visual Studio saying, sorry, it can't do anything, but we'll see. I suppose that's our disclaimer for the day.
So what we have so far is a nice, what we did last week. It's a designer on the form, and we have the usual shapes that ship as part of the diagram control.
Absolutely. So now what I want to do is insert our custom elements onto there. And I'll start out by adding, well, I'm going to add the SVG Font Awesome ones that we talked about, just to be different.
Yeah.
And what we'll do, Julian, as I start typing, you can maybe explain some things that's going on so that I can start with a car instead of a var. But well, maybe I do need that new keyboard.
So the first thing that's going to happen here is Paul is going to create a stencil. Now what a stencil is, if you go back to your days at school with mathematics and geometry, it was that nice plastic sheet with holes cut in it of various shapes. And that's what we have here in the diagram control. A stencil essentially is going to be a collection of shapes. So creating a diagram stencil, we give it an ID and we give it a displayable name. Oh, okay, Julian's Shapes.
Should the apostrophe go before the S or after the S, Julian?
It should be before the S, of course. So just declare a quick variable here called name. We'll get to it in a minute. And now we need to read the names of all the files in that, or in one of those directories. So the path is being passed into this particular method. We've got a couple of paths, as Paul says, up at the top there. You can see we can switch easily to create toolbox items for each of those paths. So we're just going to basically read through all the file names on that path, and we're going to quickly do a try catch. We'll talk about that in a minute.
I'm going to leave it with throwing the exception at the moment just so we can explain what's going on here.
Okay.
The next element really is setting up the actual shape itself. So I'll let you
I think we ought to, I think we ought to grab the name of the shape or the name of the SVG file first, because you're going to use it right now.
Oh, you want to actually get the name as I go through?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
You just like pair programming, don't you? So,
so what we're doing here is we're declaring a shape object, and we're going to call the create SVG shape method of the shape description from DevExpress diagram core.
now there's some interesting things happening if you look at the constructor here, but as Julian said, one of the things that I need to do is say, okay, now I've got this, I maybe want to get the path and just get the file name without the extension, because it would make a lot more sense to actually use that when I'm talking about things. So let's go back and say create SVG, and it's going to want the shape ID, so we'll give it the name, and we'll give it the name as the name as well. And of course now it actually wants a stream.
So time to create a stream, I think.
Yeah, we should probably go back and create a stream. We can do that. Keep our code nice. We'll do a using, and we'll do a file stream.
As it's what is expected, stream, and we'll do a, no, we don't want to do all that. We want to do file open. Come on, you've done file IO in .NET before, surely.
I know, but it's more fun if you pick things up and then, we don't get any error coming up.
Right.
So we're going to open the file, and we should probably choose the file mode as open.
Brilliant. Okay.
You happy with that now?
Yep. So now we move that line inside the using, and we have a stream. Brilliant. Close that off, and we need now to, we have a shape, quote unquote. The create SVG shape is going to read the data inside that file, and now we need to add it to, inside the using, I suppose. Yeah, we don't need it. We need to add it to the stencil. And we do that through the register shape method of the stencil. Boom, shape.
Of course, it has to be inside the using, Julian, because otherwise the variable doesn't yet exist. So
that's a good point. There we go.
Pair programming 101. All right. So at that point,
we've read through all the files in the folder. We've extracted each shape from those individual files. We've added it to the stencil, and now we need to basically register that stencil that we just created, in other words, a collection of shapes, with the toolbox. So diagram, toolbox, something or other, registrator.
And we will register the stencil.
There we go.
Which is probably called stencil.
Indeed it is.
All right.
Seems pretty easy. Now we get to the try catch.
So we'll run this and see what happens. But in essence, as you said, we're instantiating a stencil, registering that stencil, and then adding X number of shapes to that stencil. Given the fact that there are 694 current shapes in my folder, and the fact that I'm running GoToWebinar and Visual Studio, but here we have the exception. One of the things that we noticed when we were, again, preparing for this is that there are some SVG files that contain some strange elements that the parser simply can't handle. So hence why I wrapped it up in the try catch before. And one of the things I'm going to do is just swallow that exception for now and know that out of my 694, I think there's about 10 or 12 elements that actually have problems loading. So I'm not too concerned. One of the cool things is, of course, that we're in constant discussions with the engineers, and they will make it magically go away in a minor update.
Okay.
Now, we have our shapes, we have our diagram control, and of course, what do we see now?
We have a new item called Julian's Shapes, which is our stencil. So let's open it, and here we have all of those, minus the 12, font awesome icons as SVG inside the diagram control, and we can just drop one on the form. I like Rocket. Find Rocket. Rocket's great.
Find Rocket.
Oh, yeah, begins with R.
I can do a search. So,
Yeah.
a couple of things
That's
here.
interesting. That's very good, actually.
As far as adding custom shapes, all we've done is a couple of lines of code. I mean, the majority there was doing the loop, opening the file stream and assigning it, but it is that simple. However,
Oh, that's big. Oh, that's very big.
you asked for a big rocket, right?
Right. Yes, I like big rockets. Okay. That's a little too big, though.
For all intents and purposes, it is an element. It is just way too big when we bring this in. You can see the auto size of the diagram control kicking in there, just resizing as I get through some of those elements. So two things come to mind.
I think we ought to limit the size.
If I've got two rockets, of course now I've got a connector, but there's nowhere for me to connect.
That's true, actually, yes.
So let's attack both of those items at the same time.
Okay.
I'll just stop the execution of this one. There are some overloads inside the constructor that will deal with connections, but because I want to deal with the size as well as the connector, I'm going to do it all in the one similar fashion. So here I'm going to call the update method. Now, it may be, I mean, some people may be completely comfortable and familiar with some of this stuff, but seeing functions passed in as parameters to a method is not necessarily seen as the norm. So I just want to put your mind at rest that it's not as difficult as the tooltip may actually point out.
Yeah.
So let's start by setting the default size. I'm going to call update, and I'm going to say get default size, and I'm going to set that up as a new function, passing in, and it obviously knows automatically that we want to deal with a system.windows.size object, and I don't know, say 100 by 100. Got a closing bracket in there. I'm just going to run that up quickly again just to see. So with that one simple method call, now when I drag the rocket onto the canvas, expand, type in rocket, Julian gets to buy the beer because his phone went off. And we now have a rocket at 100 by 100, which of course being SVG or being a vector element is completely scalable.
Absolutely.
And any other element that I drag on there from Julian's Shapes could be an apple.
Or the Apple logo.
The Apple logo is drawn again at 100 by 100. So, you know, that's
pretty nifty, I'd say.
Straightforward and simple. The other thing that we talked about obviously was connectors. So if I want to set up where a connector could be, in this instance I'm just going to set a single connector, and again I want to make a call to the update method, so I'm going to do this nesting, and I'm going to say get connection points.
Yep. So what we're doing here, let me just explain, is we have a shape, but we need to define a set of points on the shape where we can drag a connector, so the connector can, quote, connect that shape to another shape.
IntelliSense has decided it doesn't want to help me out this time. That's okay. Size. Sorry, I want a point. I don't want a size. What's going on? My connection is going to be a point, and
probably the easiest one. Put it in the middle, say 50-50 or something. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I've actually typed this wrong to start with, because the actual get connection points takes in a couple of different attributes or properties. So we've got width, height, and location. And so this time it's going to equal a new, and we want a new system.windows.point, which is going to take, and we want width. So we're going to do half width, half height, and we're going to do, that'll do, which is going to position it where, Mr. Math?
Well, in the middle, presumably.
Absolutely. There's no tricking you some days, is there?
No, no.
All right, so again, just using this update method, passing in one of these pre-designed functions, and we're saying we want the point to be directly in the middle. When you start playing with custom elements like the SVGs, or even if you're building a shape from scratch, you've got to think about really where your connection points are going to be. I mean, if I'm dealing with this rocket, then I can't really expect, well, I could expect, but where am I going to have my actual connection points? Am I going to have them at the bottom of the fins or the top of the rocket, all those things? Whereas it makes a lot more sense, and you can see now that I've got this connection point in the center. So there are, and it's not something you'd necessarily consider when you start adding custom elements. It's like, oh yeah, I just want a connection. It's not a rectangle. It's not a matter of saying I want top left or bottom right type elements, if that makes sense.
In essence, what we're doing here is we have no idea what these SVG icons look like, so we can't predefine connection points. We have to look at each individual icon or glyph respectively, or 600 of them, and define a connection point for each, or at least one connection point for each. And to be honest, that's, if you're designing your own set of shapes, that's something that you will do along with designing the shapes. Here we're just basically showing that yes, we can put a connection point in the middle of the icon and connect it to, as Paul has done here, a rectangle.
Now the other thing that I want to point out with bringing in your own shapes, I'm not even going to call it a limitation because I don't see it as such, and I want to explain why. But one thing that I can't do is come through and change the stroke or change the background fill on my individual SVG element. And we're looking right now at just a straight block, but we've seen that the path is actually made up of some quite complex elements. I'm just going to switch the code here and pass in path 2 to use the office plan elements as an example, and Julian can again explain why we feel that it's important to highlight that, but why it's not necessarily a bad thing.
So here what we're doing here is we have a bunch of SVGs for creating an office plan. This is one of the demos we have with the diagram control, and here we have some shapes which are fairly complex shapes. They're colored, they have different elements inside the shapes, and there's no single stroke or line that we can apply the diagram controls stroke thickness or fill color to. If you like, the SVG shapes are all pre-designed. You're doing that in some other application. I mean, I use Adobe Illustrator because I've used it for years, and there's no easy way or simple way, or not necessarily simple or easy, but valid way, I would say, of saying, okay, the stroke thickness has to apply to this particular ellipse or this particular rectangle or this particular path or whatever. we just have to accept that importing SVG means the shape that we import is the way it's going to look. You can change the size, and that's about it.
Yeah, and this is just, it's a pretty simple example of just one of the flower boxes that I was playing with there. You can see just the sheer number of elements that if we were to apply a thickness or a color, there's no way of being able to easily determine where that should go. So again, it's just something I want to point out, that if you bring in your own elements and then you expect to be able to go to style and apply a style or change the stroke thickness or the color, it's not going to happen, and that is the valid reason behind what's going on.
So the ribbon items essentially apply to the built-in shapes that we have, not necessarily to the SVG shapes that we can import. And again, we can import just an SVG shape, which is a rectangle, but these options, the theme, the skin, or whatever we call it, the stroke thickness, the fill colors, and so on and so forth, will not apply to that even simple SVG shape. So just a warning.
What is really cool is in discussions with the teams, that's the sort of feedback that people want to hear. My argument was, well, you know what, if I choose this element and say I want it all to be blue, make it all blue. And there'll be a discussion, there'll be arguments between Julian and I as to who's right, who's wrong, and he always wins. He's got the bigger title. But it is important that the teams get the feedback as to what's going on. So takeaway points from this: you can import any SVG file within reason. The parsers that we're using are constantly being refined, so a couple of those elements that would come in, we're going to obviously address. If you're dealing with connectors, you need to think about where the connector is going to actually bind to. So the center of an object where you don't know the shape and size is probably the safest bet with some of those things.
Yeah. I would tend to agree with that.
We did have some amazing feedback from last week as to different use cases and being able to do different things with the diagram control. Now, one such example, and this is a company that's based here in Australia, is that they preset this background with an image, for example, a floor plan, and then they allow their clients to drag and drop elements onto that seeming pre-existing floor plan as a, this is where your furniture is going to go, or this is where the PowerPoints are going to go, or this is where the light fittings are going to go. So there's some really amazing things coming forward with companies that are already using it, or companies that want to use the system to be able to produce some stellar results. Now what we'll do, Julian, is take a look at actually creating the diagram control from scratch, but populating it programmatically.
Right, so in other words, we're going to create a diagram now, but in code, rather than dragging stuff from the toolbox.
Correct. Now we will start with, and these examples, well, all the examples we've done, we're going to have up on a blog post a little later on, and I have WinForms and WPF examples of both, so you can see the slight differences between the two. One of the ideas that came forth in the last week was to be able to build a database diagram tool. Now, I'm still all for that, and I think it will be a great, we'll do a whole presentation just on how we achieve that. Unfortunately, there's a couple of items that were not working the way that I wanted them to, so alas, we didn't get to do it. But then somebody came up with a brilliant idea of saying, well, okay, we've got a diagram control. How could we use it to display dependencies inside assemblies? And I'm sure we've all been in the situation where we've got a DLL that we're using, and whether it be a website or a desktop application, you want to know what else you have to ship with it because it's referencing other things. And a great example of that, obviously, are our own internal libraries. If I select extra editors, the DLL, what dependencies does it have? So what we've got here is a simple example of how to actually produce a diagram based on that kind of dependency. Now, I'm not going to sit and write all the code because that would just be boring. So instead, I'll step you through exactly what's going on. In fact, Julian, you can start.
Okay, so we're declaring a bunch of internal fields that we need eventually. The various colors for displaying the elements on the diagram, and we're going to have a set of assemblies which are basically a bunch of info type objects, and the references are, well, actually go to assembly info and we can see what that particular class involves. Nothing really interesting, just the name, the ability to set a level for it. So we're going to be creating a tree essentially. So this is going to be where in the tree are we at this particular point. So the name of the assembly and so on and so forth. And the reference info just underneath it is a class that defines the connectors. So this assembly references that assembly. So we have a from assembly and a to assembly. Very simple, what are the plain old C# objects, POCOs, essentially. And now we get the fun part, the load data part here. So we're going to get the executing assembly, which is obviously going to be the application itself, get its name, allow user to define load another assembly. Yeah, true.
Oh, I just think it would be nice if they if the user could actually choose maybe their own DLL from a file open dialog.
Yeah, good point, good point. So the root assembly name, that's going to be the one at the top of the tree, and then we start, we get its information, and then we start adding the assemblies that it references. So that's the assemblies.add, oh sorry, the populate children method there, just underneath, and then after we populated all the children, then we're just basically going to set the data source of the controller to the assemblies array or object that we've created, and then the references array or objects, which are the links between those assemblies. Populate children, yeah. Go on.
Sorry, again, this is using the diagram data binding controller that we talked about last week. So we're still doing this programmatically, but we're letting the diagram control look after a lot of the logic and, again, the heavy lifting by utilizing this controller in its true sense. The begin and end init is pausing the binder from doing any updates until we finish populating.
Right. So in essence, all we're doing here is we're creating a fairly simple data source of items that we want to display, and then we're going to let the diagram control actually draw those elements. So for each of the assemblies that we come across, we need to populate a list of its children and references to those children. And as Paul just said, we have a begin in it and an end in it there, so we're not constantly updating the diagram control as we find all these references to other assemblies. You can imagine that's going to take an awful long time if we're displaying, or if you like, the diagram control is actually trying to work out where to display each element as we're adding the elements. So it would take a very long time comparatively. And then we have a bunch of event handlers here. So the first one is a custom draw item, and we're doing some simple...
This is handling the actual connectors to say if the connector is contained within the selected item, we want to draw that connector's lines as red lines.
Okay. Default draw, selection change. So what we're going to allow the user to do is to click on individual items in the tree, each individual item being an assembly, and we need to say, okay, this particular item, this particular assembly now has focus, and do we need to go and populate its children? Does it have focus? Does it have child items already? Easy peasy. If not, then we have to find all its children, in other words, all of the assemblies that it references. And so on. Well, the update item, setting colors now.
Pretty much just randomizing colors, and that's it. So less than 100 lines of code. Let's see what happens when we run it.
So again, we're going to start off at the top of the tree. It's going to be this application that's running at the moment. And as Paul said, we can easily change that to show any, through a file open dialog, use any assembly. So here we have.
So I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch to the WPF version, given the font scaling on GoToWebinar and things like that. I think it displays a little cleaner. But in essence, the code is identical. The end result is going to be identical. There we go. Just it's going to use a slightly
much better. So here we have the green box. There is the top of the tree. That's the application that's running at the moment, and it references 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 other assemblies.
More.
And diagram. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it's 8. And it's the, and Paul has just selected, so we've run that particular event handler, and we're now showing the children for that particular assembly, and so on, and so on. And as we click on various assemblies there, the tree is growing, the diagram control is doing all the hard work of placing these elements on its surface, drawing the connectors, and so on, so forth. The other interesting thing here, I don't know whether it's kind of fun to play around with this kind of diagram, but it's actually trying to line up the elements underneath each other so where they're repeated there.
Now, from a strict point of view, straight away you might want to do things like stop elements being redrawn if they're already in there and recreate a relationship back. But the thing that we want to strive for here is the fact that programmatically we're adding elements to the chart, we're letting the layout engine itself take control of things, but every element that we add in is then pushing more and more items in. And you can see that whether it be a family tree, whether it's a organization chart, there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do. From when I started playing around with the concept of this particular example, which Alex put together for me in record time, I've got to add, straight away I was thinking something conceptually so simple we could extend so much. So, that could be maybe a weekend project, Julian, but have it so that it doesn't duplicate nodes that exist, maybe display as well methods or events that are inside there, and actually show you code execution or code path. Like, there's so much functionality that you could add in, and whilst we did it in code, and the idea was to show you that yes, there's a lot of power in the code, we're still talking less than 100 lines.
Absolutely, and we're making the decision. We made the decision straight away to display it as a tree. We could display it as a circular type diagram instead, which might make more sense when you're doing this kind of thing for assemblies and their references. Wouldn't be duplicating all of the items and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of ways of playing around with the diagram control. We've seen, adding new SVG items. We've seen here the ability to create a diagram and have the diagram control show it immediately. And there are a lot more methods that we could be talking about, but we only have 5 more minutes or something.
So here's what I want to do. Inside the documentation DevExpress.com, you'll actually see all of the different methods and properties and events that are available to the diagram control. And I'm in WinForms at the moment. Same thing applies to WPF. Now, as you come through, you'll see things like, if you want to change the layout programmatically, you can simply call the apply X layout method. So if I wanted to use the Sugiyama or the layered layout, then I could simply call this method. And if I obviously want more information about that, I can drill down and see the details of the different overloads that would take. Now, we've said that we'll make the 3 projects that we've got here available via the website as well, so that you can start to play around with them. And I'd probably, especially with the assembly diagram one, love to see somebody take that and make it something spectacular. There's so much you can do. One of the other examples that I've been playing around a little bit, because I'm a big fan of mind maps, is utilizing the diagram control to actually be able to create mind maps. As a developer, I find that mind maps is actually a preferred way of viewing what work has left to be done on a project, instead of traditional Kanban boards which just have everything stacked up. So just thoughts. So we have properties, events, methods, and we can see just different things that we can affect. Now, on talking to the team, one of the things that was brought up was a number of people asked questions such as, okay, how do I show a custom form or perform an action when a shape is actually double-clicked? So I want to just maybe point out to that event. Now, there is an event. If I go to the correct, I'm in the right one now. Nope, events. A lot of this stuff is really just a matter of being able to find the correct event that you want to do. But if you double-click a node in your diagram, it's going to fire the showing editor event. So at this level, you would simply need to interact and say, something like e.cancel equals true, so you're actually disabling the default behavior of that, and then invoke your own code there, which would be maybe to pop up your own editor, your own dialogue, or preset some information inside that. But if you bookmark these particular pages, it's, I don't know, Julian, I just find it relatively straightforward to jump in and find, what event is needed for what. Now, a couple of other things that I wanted to run through, and that is some key examples that are in the Support Center. In the Support Center, obviously, I shudder to think how many page articles we have in there between customer questions and examples, but would I be wrong in saying maybe many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of articles in there?
I don't know, to be honest, but it can be overwhelming, but providing you think of typical search search words, diagram control is going to be fairly easy because it's called diagram control.
So extra diagram.
Or extra diagram or something like that. So you can find these examples that we're giving, or find what other people are trying to do with the diagram control and how we've helped them. I really would, if you're going to use the diagram control, certainly browse the Support Center to see examples of how to use it and of workarounds when you are using it. I see here you're showing an XML shape, which is something else we haven't really talked about.
Correct. So I've got a number of tabs open just to highlight some examples that people might want to jump into, and these will be listed again on that blog post that, okay, I'll write, I was going to say you, but I'm not going to get away with that one. So if you're wanting to create a shape using XML, now you could, technically you can use XAML to create shapes as well. The problem is if you're using the WinForms version of the control, you have to make a reference to the presentation core library, which doesn't, there's some inherent issues, .NET issues with scaling and DPI. So the preference if you're using WinForms is to use an XML shape control. So here's an example of how to create that, or what the XML would look like. Again, with all the code inside to actually build that and add it either directly to your diagram, or as we saw today, to actually create the stencil and add it to the stencil. We've got another example here on creating descendants and serializing properties. Basically, the diagram control has been around for a little while now, so the team have gone through and produced some examples from the most asked questions, or the things that people are using in real-world scenarios. There's, of course, the graph layout using different algorithms for layouts. We in turn have how to store your database, or store your diagrams in a database instead of you implementing the file dialog. So if you're building a custom system and you don't want the user to be creating these XML files but store it internally, so it takes you through all of those steps. Using XAML, or to actually create your shape with connection points. So again, talks about the actual DPI scaling issue as well there, so some links for people to read through. Creating the diagram containers and registering them, so similar to what we talked about today, but actually using containers. And then using the custom draw event and custom icons inside diagrams. So there's some great examples, which again I'll list out in more detail on that blog post that people can link to and just start to work through. Now, Julian, how are we going for questions?
We're doing good. Questions that have been asked have been answered. The team are in the background helping out there. For example, is there a tool for converting traditional image formats to SVG, which is not really to do with the diagram control? Yes, there are. Any plans for a shape designer? There, in other words, where the connection points can be drag and dropped. So in other words, you have a shape and you want to define the connection points for that shape actually on some kind of designer form. There are no such plans for that, unfortunately. It's a great idea. We've got to be careful here, because the diagram control is about drawing diagrams, and before long some questions or some ideas that people have, we're into basically going into Illustrator type country. Where do we stop the diagram control, and where do we start creating SVG editors and stuff like that? It would be really nice to have an SVG editor where we could define the connection points, agreed, but it's a little far beyond what we're trying to do with the diagram control. Can we define a shape as a container? And the answer is there is a separate element called diagram container. So we didn't actually show that, but yes, it can be a container.
Well, one of the examples that I pointed there actually does go into detail on creating that that container object.
Right. This is pretty much it. Oh, there's some more down here.
We'll drag and drop events.
Go on.
Oh, sorry, I'm further down than you. Will drag and drop events be added to the diagram control? As Alex has answered, yes, the drag and drop API is on the hit list to be worked or improved or added to. Now, I suppose just to take a quick sidebar, Julian, the feedback, whether it be from the webinar, from the video that gets posted, or from the blog post, the team can sit in a big room and try and think of all the different scenarios that you guys can work on this stuff, or just keep providing the feedback. It's, it drives those the future development as far as what people are asking
Right.
for. So,
and when you do provide feedback, I think it's a great idea if you provide some kind of scenario where the particular feature you're looking for or the particular feature you're asking for can be used. I mean, it's all very well to say, yeah, it'd be nice to have the ability to add connection points to an SVG image, but better still is to say, well, the scenario I'm looking at is an office plan scenario where I really need to be able to, because I'm defining the outlets in a particular office plan, and I really need to be able to define where the connection points go because X, Y, and Z, or whatever it happens to be. It's the more information you can provide with the feedback, I think the more chance it has of being prioritized higher than, say, some other feedback. So just be aware of that.
That's a couple of questions that we're just waiting on the team to be able to answer fully, but is it possible to resize a shape to its contents? So by contents, David, I think you mean, for example, the text element. If we type in more text, can the rectangle grow? Which I think is a cool idea.
Yep, it is.
There's a couple of ASP.NET questions there, Julian. Would you like to answer those?
ASP.NET is one of those bits of feedback that we really need. Yes, we're only talking about WinForms or WPF at the moment. ASP.NET is in the plans. We need to be able to prioritize it. It's a lot different than WinForms WPF. Obviously, we're talking inside the browser, a lot more SVG, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So please, 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 more feedback, and let us know that you really need ASP.NET. It's being designed, but I have no information that I can give out about timelines or schedules for when it'll be available.
Excellent. Now, there's a few questions that are showing in the list that are probably a little deep in technical nature, so we will have the team answer those. Best thing to do is add them to your support center or email Julian or myself. I will put up.
Support Center is a great idea. If you have an idea for a feature, as I say, describe it fully, add it to the Support Center, it becomes a suggestion, people can then follow the suggestion, and we take account of the number of people following a particular suggestion. So I see Demetrius here is saying, do you support layers to show, hide, or lock figures? So if you think to Illustrator, for example, you can design your diagram or your image in Illustrator with layers, and you can lock those layers so that they don't get changed. Brilliant idea. Brilliant idea. Doesn't support it at the moment, but
we don't support layers, but we do support locking of individual elements. And of course, you do have that layered system where you've got elements on top of elements. So we do support that Z order. So not a full layer, but you could implement certainly something similar.
Right. But I think Demetrius is asking for a step beyond that, where you can turn layers on and off or lock them and so on and so forth. So yes, please add them to Support Center or add them as comments to the blog post that Paul is going to be writing. Yes. But I think on that we have to call Amanda back. Amanda?
Hello, gentlemen.
Well, hello.
All right. Thank you so very much. We do have several webinars coming up. You can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars. Our next webinar is February 7th at 10 a.m. presented by Web Program Manager Mehul Harry, getting started with Angular 2 and DevExtreme widgets. And then into March 14th, using DevExpress MVVM Magic with WPF and WinForms Part 2 presented by Don Wibier. And March 28th, ASP.NET MVC frequently asked questions answered. So those are our webinars coming up. And again, you can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars. Also, I posted the link to our DevExpress YouTube channel in the chat box, and also the link to the Diagram Control Getting Started webinar that Julian and Paul did last week, if you want to watch that one.
Yeah. Sorry, Amanda, if one of the things that we want to also ask people, I've just put the webinar page up there, is what they'd like to see, because you've told us we have to do more of these things.
Yes. And you always listen to what I say, don't you?
So let's get some feedback as well as to what other things people would like to see on some of these presentations. I mean, we love doing them, but we also want to make it relevant to what people have. So feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. All right, so with that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul and Julian. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.